Hello, I'm Emily Rhodes, and this month I'm going to be talking to you about this book, A Girl Returned by Donatella di Pietrantonio. I can never get that right. Translated by Anne Goldstein, who some of you might know as the translator for Elena Ferrante. So yeah, a really exciting book. You can see how beautiful it looks, slim novella, but do not be fooled by its size. It contains so much, so many big ideas in this book. And actually a word that came up a lot in our discussion of this book in Emily's Walking Book Club on the Heath was the word poetic. And like poetry, which condenses big ideas into sort of poignant, rich images, this book also, I felt there were quite a few images that held so much in very few words. So the basic premise of the book is set in 1970s Italy, and the girl returned, or La Minuta as she's called in Italian. We don't get her name throughout the book. She's being returned from a family who raised her to her birth family. So that gives rise to this quite complicated situation with there being essentially two families, two mothers, and whenever we're talking about it, we always got into a muddle saying, you know, that mother, no, which mother, no, this mother, the birth mother, blah, blah, blah. But the writer really sets up a contrast between these two families. She shows them as being from these two different worlds. And one thing we really appreciated about this book is that it shows quite a different Italy to, you know, the Italy of our dream holidays. Here aren't the Duomos and the villas and the swimming pools. And this showed the Minuta coming from this very comfortable, relatively wealthy family, but going, I think it's 50 kilometres away, the town where she's, where her birth family live. And going in that 50 kilometres, it's like she enters a different world. It's so much poorer, it's so much tougher. And the writer shows this in various ways. And one way that we all really hit on was food. You know, the food here is eaten really fast at the table. There's a wonderful scene where her brother brings back a prosciutto, and as he slices it, the family take the slices before they reach the plate. Whereas in the wealthier family, you know, it's a complicated lunch of various courses with different silverware. So food, there's also family size. So in the wealthy family, obviously she's the only child in that family, and we see also her friend Patrizia. It's also a single child family, whereas in her birth family it feels like there are, you know, hundreds of hands reaching for the food. And also in the language, you know, there's a lot of talk about talking in Italian rather than speaking in dialect. But you know, it's a complex situation, and instead of just showing the sort of wealthy side and the poor side, there are these kind of layers. There's also what's called in the book the gypsies and the gypsy families, which seem to be, you know, a step on from the poor family. And there's also the scene in the countryside, this wonderful glimpse of this old woman who sits under a tree and doles out advice and medicine. So we see a complicated portrait of Italy, but I think it is really distilled in these two very different setups. And the Minuta, the girl, has to try and negotiate the complicated crossing from one world to another. And we see how much she loses. She arrives with this bag of shoes in this family where they barely have one set of clothes each. You know, they're all kind of rags and falling apart, and she's not going to need her ballet slippers there. So how does she try and cross over into this other territory? What does she lose? But also there is a feeling of resilience and positivity in this feeling that actually she loses a lot, but she does gain something. So there are these two mothers. The mother, in fact, there's a tiny quote I'm going to try and find very quickly, because it I think it demonstrates this idea of beauty and sort of the poetry of these words. Sorry, so the awful thing is I always make a card with all my notes on and all the page numbers of the important bits, and terribly I've lost the card. But here we go, I've got the page. So it's on page 115. So she says she's getting her homework back. So she does really well in school. And she gets this good mark for her Latin homework. She says, I felt lost as I looked at it lying on the desk. My mother would indeed have been pleased if she could have seen it. She still worried about me, albeit from a distance, more than she worried about her illness. I refuse to stop believing that. So just to say the reason that's given for the mother returning her is that she's ill. My mother's ill. And yet in certain melancholy moods, I felt forgotten. I'd fallen out of her thoughts. There was no longer any reason to exist in the world. I softly repeated the word mama 100 times, until it lost all meaning and was only an exercise of the lips. I was an orphan with two living mothers. One had given me up with her milk still on my tongue. The other had given me back at the age of 13. I was a child of separations, false or unspoken kinships, distances. I no longer knew who I came from. In my heart, I don't even know now. Sorry, I don't know even now. It's so powerful, this idea of being given up with milk still on your lips. And, you know, she feels like an orphan with two living mothers. This unbearable loss is horrific. And one thing that came up in our discussion on the Heath is that, yes, there are these two mothers, but there are also other maternal figures shown in the book. There's her teacher who kind of nurtures her and fosters her. There's her friend Patrizia's mother who goes and feeds her. She ends up staying in a boarding house, and there's a sort of mother figure there. And it feels as though she's constantly looking for a mother. You know, she feels so abandoned. She's looking for that nurturing, that care in all these women, and it always falls short. It's never quite right. And we decided in our Zoom discussion that this idea of the search for the perfect mother is quite a sort of thing. You know, it's quite meta, it's quite big. It's one of the big things in life, perhaps especially in the Catholic Church, with the Virgin Mary and that role model of a mother too. So there's this real yearning in the book and this real pain of separation and not having the perfect mother. But where I think this book does so well is that it does give you some positivity, and, you know, she doesn't find the perfect mother in any of these figures, but instead there's this wonderful relationship between her and her sister, her newly discovered sister in her birth family, Adriana, who, okay, another bit to find, this is, I think, possibly my favourite line in the book. They have to share a bed, and the mattress is all sort of misshapen and stinky because Adriana wets the bed every night. And they lie top to toe. And it says, every night she lent me the sole of her foot to hold against my cheek. I had nothing else in that darkness inhabited by breath. This idea of feeling so alone, but having this closeness, you know, this foot against your cheek, when there's nothing to give, you know, they don't have anything, but she lends her this piece of her. And the pair of them really come together and nurture each other and care for each other. And especially as the book progresses, you feel that the protagonist has almost is beginning to find this ideal mother in herself. And she has this caring, nurturing instinct towards her sister. And the book ends in this really positive image of the two sisters together. And I just love that idea that, you know, you can look everywhere to find the perfect mother, and, you know, you're never going to find what you're looking for, even if our circumstances aren't quite as grim as this. But there's always the possibility to become that yourself. There's a lot more we talked about. There's the complicated family, the siblings, all of whom have fascinating things to bring to the table. The other thing I want to mention here is the title, A Girl Returned, and this idea of return and returning, and how impossible that is actually to return somewhere. And actually we talked really powerfully, I think, about our own experiences of trying to return, trying to go back, but finding that it can't happen. You can't, if you go back geographically somewhere, that place has changed, you know, over time. You can't really go back in time, which is what you're asking to do when you return somewhere. So we talked about that and the idea of return and the impossibility of return. We see it here. We also see it in a lot of books about migration, moving countries and trying to go back to a home country and the impossibility of that. And I also mentioned the idea of translation. If you think of translation literally, I think means being borne across, carried across. And if you translate something back, how impossible that is. So, you know, this book is translated from the Italian to the English. If you were to then translate it back into the Italian, you would get a completely different translation to the original. The original is impossible to return to, really. And then one Walker pointed out the absolutely sort of grim fact of the pun in the word return, that in a way the girl isn't doing the returning herself, she is being returned, just like you would return something to a shop. And at one point she actually complains of being treated like a package or a parcel. So there's this idea that she is, you know, not only can she not return, she can't even do the returning herself, she is just being returned. And the absolute grimness of that. Of course, it tied in quite well with our Lem Sisse book last month. And actually a few people said, actually, this is enough. We need something a bit more positive next time. So I hear you. Our next book is going to be Howard's End by E.M. Forster, and I'm currently busy programming the first books of 2022. So watch this space for some more great books to read. Have you read this book? What did you think of it? Please let me know your thoughts. I love to hear from you in the comments or drop me a message. And a reminder, you can find out more about Emily's Walking Book Club on our Substack, which is just emilyswalkingbookclub.substack.com. Thank you so much.